think when you put all that together and the fact that the Russian military have not really been able to do very much, you can see why something like Tomahawks could be, not necessarily a game changer for Ukraine, but a game changer for the Russians.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1334 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've got the privilege of talking to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, OBE. And it's on a Saturday, so he's giving up a little bit of rugby time, I think, to talk to us. But Hamish, Director of Doctors Under Fire, former British Army Colonel, an expert on CBRN and biosecurity, and author of Chemical Warrior. And you're an old friend of Frontline. Hamish, welcome back.
Philip, thanks very much for having me. Delight to be on, especially on a Saturday.
Yes, well, it's great. Well, we had to, apologies, we were going to talk yesterday, but President Trump and President Zelensky decided to hold their meeting late in UK time. So it was important, I think, that we got that. We saw Zelensky in the White House yesterday. Trump seems to be focused very much on this Budapest summit that he set up with Putin and suggesting that both sides should declare a victory. What do you think is really going on here?
Well, I think really interesting, Philip, and it's been a really important and fascinating week. Of course, it was 2 days ago that we understood that Trump had a 2-hour meeting or 2-hour telephone call with President Putin, which was a bit of a shocker. Mm-hmm. We were all expecting for Zelensky to go to the White House yesterday, Friday, for a meeting, really to try and iron out some of the issues. And the big topic was the Tomahawk missiles that we will come back to. I suppose Trump, full of bravado after his very successful trip to Egypt and Israel at the beginning of the week after the unlikely but very welcome ceasefire that he seems to have managed to organise in Gaza. We're all rather hoping that he would be focusing and do something similar in Ukraine, and that's exactly what he said he would do. The meeting yesterday, we understood before the meeting that Putin and Trump had agreed to meet in Budapest in the next 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And the irony of Budapest, should not be missed by anybody. It was, of course, there that the Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994 by the Americans, by the UK, ourselves, and by the Russians, guaranteeing the security of Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. Wind forward to today, and we're in a very different position. So the choice of Budapest, I presume, because Viktor Orban, president of Hungary, it seems to be the closest European leader to Russia, and it is probably the only country in Europe that Putin could go to that he wouldn't be arrested in. So, yeah, really extraordinary activity that's going on, and what really did Zelensky get out of yesterday's meeting?
Well, it's interesting. I think I saw Trump, or a statement from Trump, where he said or confirmed that it could be being played by Putin. I've seen some commentary on what went on in Alaska, and apparently at the summit in Alaska, Donald Trump got really quite annoyed because Vladimir Putin just gave him a couple of hours of Putin's view of the history of everything that was going on, and was refusing to give in and negotiate a ceasefire. Do you think we're going to see anything different in Budapest, or is Putin just playing Trump as he seems to always have done?
Well, yeah, I think it's no doubt that Putin is playing Trump rather better than Trump is playing Putin. But having said that, or certainly somebody like me, very close supporter of the Ukrainians, were hoping that these long-range Tomahawk missiles would be released to Ukraine, because we're not talking about game-changing here, but really significant. And the mention of Tomahawk missiles seems to be the thing that has precipitated Putin's call to the White House.
Do you think he's genuinely worried about them?
I think so. I mean, I wrote a piece in the Telegraph yesterday exactly about this, and then did a running commentary with people who commentate. And there was a whole range of issues being discussed, and not least, bizarrely, there are quite a lot of Russian bots and pro-Russians who buy the Telegraph, as I'm sure who buy the Times as well, and the vitriol coming out of them about these Tomahawk missiles. Now, you and I saw them in many campaigns over the years, but some people sort of saying, well, these are old weapons. Well, to a point, they are well trusted and tried weapons, and as we know, they are regularly updated. So the Tomahawk missiles that we would have seen in the Gulf in 2003 or other operations are not the same Tomahawk missiles that are available now. They are very much uprated, and I think the Russians are really frightened. The Tomahawk missiles did a number on the Iranian air defense assets when the Americans attacked nuclear facilities there. So we know that they are highly capable. I think the Russians are concerned that they actually won't be able to knock these things down. Although they're not hypersonic missiles, but they're pretty clever the way they nap of the earth flying and then hit their targets. And it seems clear the Americans are still giving the Ukrainians a lot of targeting advice. So I think the Russians are really concerned about these Tomahawk missiles, and they seem to have been and I think they still are a key bargaining pitch. I was just rereading what Trump had been saying last night in the White House, and he has not turned the Tomahawk issue off at all. It's an ongoing thing, and one assumes that this is going to be a key bargaining chip in Budapest. We know how much the Russians don't want these Tomahawk missiles. So what are they prepared to do in order that they don't go into the Ukrainian hands? So that might well be significant. I mean, Trump also said, it is time that Zelensky spoke to Putin and they agreed some sort of peace. And he's sort of suggesting you should freeze the front lines as they are now and then go ahead. I think, conversely, very interesting listening to the President of Finland this morning on the Today program, Radio 4, talking about this and actually sort of being rather more upbeat about European defence and what Europeans prepared to do. And Finland, that has had to trade land to the Russians over the years. I mean, he did not discount that Ukraine should get some of its territory back, and he said, as leader of Finland, he would never accept that Crimea was a part of Russia. So, and Europe seems to be galvanizing itself. Also, this week we heard about the 4-point plan to defend Europe with various drone shields and other shields and everything else. So, that must be a galvanizing thing, I think, for the Ukrainians. So, come the Budapest summit, wherever it is, I still think that there is something to play for the Ukrainians. I think it's really disappointing that Zelensky is not sort of not flying back to Ukraine with Tomahawk codes in his pockets, as it were. But if this is a key bargaining chip, then let's hope that Trump plays it appropriately when he meets Putin in whenever it is 2 weeks' time.
Yeah. It's always better to talk rather than to blow things up. And if this can lead to talking, well, maybe that's a good thing. But the Tomahawk cruise missile, we're putting an awful lot in there. It's got a shorter range than the Ukrainian Flamingo missile. It's got a smaller warhead than the Ukrainian Flamingo missile. And it costs significantly more to produce and needs an awful lot of support from the Americans. Why are we so focused on the Tomahawk when the Ukrainians seem to be developing capabilities themselves that, on paper, if you're doing your top trumps of missiles, this would trump Trump's Tomahawk?
Well, I mean, you make a lot of good points there, Philip. I think the Tomahawk has just develop a psychology that perhaps is beyond its own capability, and in negotiation terms, that is probably only a good thing. I think one of the issues of the Tomahawk is whether Ukraine could get them in numbers. And earlier this week, Trump was talking about hundreds and thousands, not onesies and twosies. Now, 1,000 Tomahawk missiles, I think, really would be hugely significant, because the Ukrainians haven't developed that sort of level yet. I don't know the full capabilities of the Flamingo, but for me, the sort of marginal advantage the Tomahawk has is its ability to get to the target.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're seeing with a lot of operations in Ukraine and to a lesser extent from Russian defense, with so much focus on air defense at the moment, actually it would appear, Ukraine shooting down about 80 to 90% of things thrown at them. We don't know. It's probably similar to what's been going the other way, but something like a Tomahawk does, with its snap of the earth flying, its sort of capabilities in that respect. Maybe, I'm not an air defense specialist. We perhaps need one of our other chums to discuss those sort of things. But from what I understand, these things flying at roof, treetop height at speed are a lot more difficult to take down than even a hypersonic missile, say, flying at, a couple of thousand feet. So whether it's true or not, the assumption is that Tomahawks can get to target. If you can get them up, if you've got 1,000 or so, that is hugely, hugely significant. And the assumption is that as you quite rightly say, the sort of backroom staff, the logistics required for it, we are assuming that if the Americans give the missiles, they're going to, provide the other wherewithal to do it. So the most important thing I expect at the moment is the psychology that these things are battle-winning assets. And, certainly I would do nothing to dispel that psychology and rumor, as it were.
Yeah. Do you think we're starting to see the first cracks in Putin's resolve, and where he seems to believe that Russia can win this war militarily? His energy infrastructure, or his oil and gas infrastructure, is being hit quite hard by the Ukrainians at the moment. The front line, there are talks about advances and then them being pushed back, and Russia capturing more territory and the Ukrainians capturing a little bit back here and there. What's your reading from the front line right up to the operational level, and of Putin potentially getting to this position where he suddenly realizes he can't win?
Yeah, no, I think there's quite a lot. And actually, if we go sort of start off in Russia, as you say, the oil industry has been really severely hit, particularly the ability to make petrol for cars. That it's not propaganda; it's reality. There is a shortage of petrol. Even the elites in St. Petersburg and Moscow are having to queue for petrol, and it's twice as expensive as it ever was. I mean, very interesting. There was a piece widely reported on various media a couple of days ago about people in St. Petersburg, singing songs in the main square about Putin's downfall. Now, that is rare. What is even rarer is that the Russian state police weren't there to beat them all up and chuck them away. So there does seem to be some disquiet. And for the Russians who, if you average rank and file Russian who has been suffering because of the expense the war is making for their food, they can't get fuel. If they can get a flight to Sochi to go and bathe in the Black Sea, they're delayed because there's a Ukrainian drone. They're just, people are getting hacked off. I think when you start going to the front line, as you said, not much has happened. Although this week there has been a really big, or over the last few weeks, a big build-up of Russian forces in the sort of Petrovsk area, and they were trying to do. There were reports of up to 60,000 Russians, but apparently most of those were prisoners, ex-prisoners, prisoners who've been released to go and fight in the front. Very little training, and supported allegedly by 300 tanks. But that thrust was very quickly dealt with, and masses of casualties. The UK MOD intelligence update, even up to a week or so ago, was saying the Russians are still losing 1,000 soldiers a day in some respects. So the war on the front's not going very well. To try and bolster the forces, they're putting untrained people, and again reports coming out, and I admit they might not be coming from pro-Russian sources, is that the Russians are now having to start recruiting in numbers ethnic Russian, Russians, white Russians. In other words, the kids of the elite who have been spared so far. So I think all of that is building a head of steam. The economy is really struggling, and again, the president of Finland today on Radio 4 was saying, that was what he was getting from his intelligence staffs and across Europe, that Russia is all its resources, all its sort of reserves that it's put by for a rainy day have gone. Very little money is coming in, particularly from oil at the moment. If the Indians stop buying oil, then things are getting really tough. So I think when you put all that together, and the fact that the Russian military have not really been able to do very much, you can see why something like Tomahawks could be, not necessarily a game changer for Ukraine, but a game changer for the Russians. So, is Putin about to be overthrown? Are there, people in the background waiting to stab in the back? Well, not obviously, but Russian leaders who don't fulfill their promises, and Putin's promise of subjugating Ukraine and everything else is looking really, really unlikely at the moment. So I think the pressure is ramping up. And that's why we're all hoping that Trump will do the right thing in Budapest and go for the jugular rather than offering Putin a way out, which he, as you said earlier, sort of seemed to do in Alaska and that summit. So yeah, I think in Europe we must feel more confident. Hopefully the Ukrainians are feeling more confident. But Putin, rather Trump, is the one who could probably tip them over the edge. So let's hope he does that rather than offer Putin a way out.
Yeah. We seem to focus on a lot of the time the fact that US support is critical, but you're right in you're saying Europe is stepping up. Do you think it's getting to the point now where actually the reliance on US support is beginning to wane and tail off, and actually Ukraine by itself and with support from Europe will have the ability to continue to fight at the levels it's been fighting at? And how do you think this is going to end up?
Well, I think if you look at it purely rationally from the capability that Europe has and is developing, one must come to the conclusion that, yeah, absolutely you can do that. I mean, the other thing the Finnish president said, just remember the Russian economy is pretty small.
Yeah.
I think it's either equivalent or smaller than Greece and a bit smaller than the Italian economy. Yep. So when you look at the financial muscle that Europe has, when you look at the forces that Europe has against what Russia, has today, or not perhaps that it had 3 or 4 years ago, you've got to come to the conclusion that actually if we went all in, there is no reason at all that Ukraine wouldn't prevail. So yeah, if Trump walks away, I don't see the Russian hordes steaming, accelerating west, because I think Europe has the capability to do that. But a bit like Trump, Europe sort of ebbs and flows a little bit. Where individual leaders get focused a little bit on Ukraine one day and then are off on things the other day. And in this country, there's so many other issues that Starmer is dealing with, and he knows, and he's probably been told by his MPs that they want to stay in their jobs in 3 years' time, and winning in Ukraine might not be the way that they're going to do that. So it's a pretty complex issue, and I'm sure things look very different in Kyiv than they do in London and other European headquarters. But ultimately, of course, the Americans do have the ability themselves to shift the dial on most things on the planet, and this is something they could do it. But there will come to a point soon, I think, Philip, where perhaps Ukraine and Europe thinks, does the heavy involvement and heavy reliance on Trump make things better or worse in Ukraine? And I hope that if we decide that it's making things worse or not even changing anything, I hope that's where European leaders will step in and go, right, we'll take the lead from now on.
Yeah. But even when we compare the size difference between Russia from an economic perspective and even a military perspective and Europe, Putin seems to be taking the fight to Europe. We've had MiG-31 incursions into Estonian airspace. We've had drone overflights of German critical national infrastructure, Danish airfields, Swedish military We've got constant threats against undersea cables and pipelines. We've got Russian spy ships around the coast of UK and Ireland. Putin doesn't seem to be sitting back and going, we put aside the cyber threats that are coming in on a daily basis. He's not sitting on his hands and going, I'm really concerned. He seems to be taking the fight in the grey zone, as we refer to it, out into Europe and out into the rest of the world. Should we be concerned about that? Do you think he's going to ease back?
Well, as you will have seen, as I saw, Baroness Manningham-Buller 2 weeks ago was saying exactly what you said, Philip. We are already in a hybrid war with Russia, and to dismiss that will be at our peril. I know yesterday the head of MI5 was talking about similar stuff with the Chinese, but I think this is the way that Russia do business. You'll know better than anybody else that this is how they operate, trying to have influence, trying destabilize ourselves, and we have got to be aware of that, and we have got to be, we have got to attack back. Now, I'm sure we are in various ways, but for anybody who thinks sat in the home counties of England, you're well out of it. Well, actually, the next time you have a cyber issue and you can't board an aeroplane at Heathrow, don't assume that it's just bad luck, because a whole host of issues, be it the Jaguar Land Rover cyber attack or others. The intelligence services are saying, the Russians might not be directly involved, but their DNA is all over it. So I think this is something that we have to accept. Russia is waging a physical war in Ukraine, but it's, as you say, it's fighting us in the grey zone as well. And we need to make sure that we're up to it and we're resilient and aware of it. We can't just, wish away these issues. This is the way that Putin operates. This is the way the Russians have always done it. This is what the Cold War was all about. We're now in a new, whatever you want to call it, hybrid war, Cold War, fighting in the grey zone. It's the reality of today, and we need to absolutely sort of front up to it and make sure that we're capable and resilient so that it doesn't adversely affect ourselves and our economy in the country.
Yeah, well, of course, in your particular area of expertise, we've had attacks on the streets of the United Kingdom with chemical agents and with radiological capability, polonium-210 and then Novichok. Do you think we should be concerned that there might be, or there's a potential for an increased number of those sorts of attacks going on? And do you think we need to get our civil preparedness up a little bit better?
Well, I think taking your last question first, absolutely, I think we should do. And you and I are just old enough to remember what it was like in the Cold War and the sort of civil preparedness that happened. I'm personally parking the nuclear piece here. They're talking about escalation. They're talking, the Russians are talking about escalation, and Lukashenko, the farcical Belarusian leader, is threatening us with nuclear attack when he doesn't have any weapons, but that's another issue. So I park that, but in the hybrid war, almost anything does go, and I think people need to be more resilient. I'm not expecting to see Novichok attacks and polonium attacks, to the general public, as it were. But it's the sort of thing that we know that the Russians get up to, and I'm pretty sure actually when we look at the resilience of our security services, counter-terror police, and even the border security service, that they have got sort of half an eye to this. However, these sort of extraordinary events, like we saw at Salisbury, and of course the murder of Litvinenko, are pretty few and far between, and there are many other threats that are much more regular. These ones get the headlines because of what they are, and we always say in the chemical, biological sort of counter-terror world, these things, the impact is absolutely massive, but the likelihood is pretty low. And you and I both know when you're trying to be resilient against threats, you've really got to try and make sure you're most resilient against the most likely threat, and you take risks elsewhere. So as your point about the hybrid war and the grey zone war, yeah, that will go on. Things like that will happen. But if we can interdict 99% of these attacks, then that is what that is good enough. I mean, it sounds a terrible thing to say, but yeah, if we can stop the majority, then we're pretty much as good as we're going to get.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. But as Europe comes together, we've got Saka in the last week turning around and calling for a common set of rules of engagement to be more aggressive and shoot down any threats that come into NATO airspace and all the rest of it. Do you think that's the right move? And do you think Europe needs to be more aggressive in its responses to Vladimir Putin to deter him properly?
I do actually feel it, and I know some people have been saying that this is not the way. But to me, Putin exploits weakness and respects strength. And I was actually in Syria when the Turks shot down a Russian jet that strayed into Turkish airspace. And, people might not remember, or they would have remembered if something went seriously wrong. Yeah. But that was it. That was the last time the Russian jets dared go into Turkish airspace. And I think Putin is just testing the West. Yeah. Sure, the Poles shot down, or I think NATO jets shot down a load of Russian drones. But when you've got MiG-31s and others flying into Estonian airspace and potentially European airspace, to not shoot them down is almost encouraging further incursions, in my opinion. So, and I'm sure if a Western jet strayed into Russian airspace, that's exactly what we get. Let's not forget the Korean airliner a few years ago, the 747, I think it was, strayed into Russian airspace and got shot down, and a couple of hundred people were killed. Now, people might not forget that, but this is the reality of dealing with the Russians. So I absolutely agree that if Russian jets fly into European airspace and they don't turn around within a couple of seconds, then yeah, they should be shot down, because I think the Russians are just testing us, and they will keep testing until they find a weakness, and then they'll exploit it.
So you've been examining this for a long time now, as I have. Do you think we're going to be talking about this conflict this time next year?
Well, I think we're certainly going to be talking about Ukraine this time next year. I would be really surprised if the fighting is still happening, because I don't think that the Russians, have the capability, and I don't, I'm sure, the West doesn't have the appetite to keep, and certainly Americans don't have the appetite to keep the war going for 12 months. So if we are, I think we're going to be in a really dangerous position. So yeah, I'm not confident. I'm hoping rather than confident, which is not a great place to be in when you're making military decisions. But I cannot see that there will still be that the Ukrainians and the Russians be fighting this time next year. What the position will be, I'm not entirely sure. I am hoping that at the Budapest, I was almost going to say the Budapest Memorandum, the Budapest Summit in the coming days will lead to some sort of ceasefire and some sort of peace negotiations. And I just hope that Trump realizes actually Ukraine and Europe are sort of on the front foot now than perhaps we haven't been for, since the beginning of the war. And he needs to exploit that position rather than trade too much to Putin, and Putin gets everything that he wants.
Well, on that, I think positive note, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and let's hope that we see the Budapest Memorandum take 2, where people actually live up to it. But Hamish, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks very much for having me, Philip.